in a blue Sirius towards his sleepy eyes. They slid like wonder. Women small and tall, of every shape and size, in many languages, to lisp, we do, to Henry almost waking. What is the night at all? His closed eyes beckon you. In the marriage of the dead, a new routine. He gasped, his crowded vows past lids shut tight, and many rings fumbled on. His coffin, like Grand Central, to the brim, filled up and emptied with the lapse of life. Which one will waken him? Oh, she must startle like a fallen gown, content with speech like an old sacrament, in deaf ears lying down. Blazing through darkness, till he feels the cold and blindness of his hopeless tenement, while his black arms unfold.
John Berryman, poet, scholar, critic, teacher. Winner of the Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award for his major poetic achievement, The Dream Songs. A man of complex visions, haunted by the suicide death of his father, caught in a seemingly endless battle against his own alcoholism, he was nonetheless described by many as indestructible, a man of passion and wit.
I have friends. I have about 15 real friends, scattered through the world, but mostly, of course, in the United States. That's men. Then I have about 15 women, often their wives, who are also readers of mine. Now, I call 30 readers quite a lot.
That's not bad, and it expands from
Don't
there.
you think it's quite good? I'm impressed. And they write me wonderful letters about anything I publish.
And where...
Have you got 30 readers?
I haven't got 3 readers. Very simple.
Well, then I've been boasting. 30 is too many. That's a lie. Maybe I have 8. Does that make you feel better?
That makes me feel much more cheerful.
Okay, 8. But those people are awful bright.
In his last work, an uncompleted novel called Recovery, Berryman wrote, "I am at the point of death, physical, mental, spiritual. Highly promising. I have nothing to lose. There exists the lock. My only concern is the key." On a January morning in 1972, at the age of 57, John Berryman jumped to his death from a bridge on the University of Minnesota campus.
John was the latest of the poets of his generation to come into his own, because Jarrell and Lowell and Belmore Schwartz were all approximately his age. John was a slow developer. John was known to other poets and to a few critics long before the public ever. And then his public fame got mixed up with the image of John the Wild Man with the beard and the drinking. And though John was a wild man and a drinker, he was a very intense worker, which people get confused about. People mustn't think that because John was wild, John was somehow not conscientious, not an exact workman, not a man who didn't know exactly what he was doing at all times.
But there was always this lovely confusion, which was very exciting to live with. I mean, you always felt that there was something. That the reason that there was so much confusion is that you know, there was a very busy project taking place, and you were part of it, and that was nice. I like that, and I think John did too.
I think that the writing is the product of a more intense life, which works backward, reacts upon that life, until the excitement reaches an unbearable pitch, and the inspired writer feels that he's dying. He feels that his inspiration is a threat to his existence because the walls of his being can't contain so much pressure. I often saw John in that state. He was beside himself when he was writing, and the thing that he had prayed for had come and was killing him.
He was born John Smith in 1914 in McAllister, Oklahoma, the oldest of two sons. His father, John Allen Smith, was a banker and member of the National Guard. His mother, Martha, a teacher. A decade later, the Smith family moved to Tampa, Florida. Friction developed between the parents. The father's behavior became erratic. In 1926, when John was 12 years old, his father shot himself to death outside the boy's window. The son's wound never healed. In later years, the pain and rage would reverberate through the dream songs. The family moved to Connecticut and then New York. Martha married again, another banker, John Angus McAlpin Berryman, who formally adopted the two boys. With a new name, but not a new identity, John Berryman attended public school on Long Island and then South Kent Prep School in Connecticut. There, at the age of 14, he lay down on the railroad tracks before an oncoming train and had to be hauled off. Unhappy at South Kent, Berryman took his college boards a year early and was accepted at Columbia University, where he fell under the spell of English professor Mark Van Doren. Berryman began to write poetry. With classmate Robert Giroux, who years later became his publisher, John worked on and contributed to the Columbia Review. Graduating Phi Beta Kappa, Berryman sailed to England to study at Clare College in Cambridge. It was a happy time. Once, before making a trip to pay homage to William Butler Yeats, his friend and companion Dylan Thomas, full of scorn for Yeats, tried unsuccessfully to get Berryman drunk. 1942, John Berryman married Eileen Patricia Mulligan. A psychologist, Eileen sometimes administered Rorschach tests to John and his poet friends. The marriage spanned 14 years, a productive period for John. His first book of poetry, called Poems, was published. Then, The Dispossessed, and a highly acclaimed critical biography of novelist Stephen Crane. It was a time of awards, fellowships, 10 years of teaching off and on at Princeton. But the marriage began to crumble. John had several extramarital affairs. He was seeing a psychiatrist on a weekly basis and drinking heavily. In 1954, he joined the University of Minnesota faculty. 2 years later, Berryman's first long poem was published by former classmate Robert Giroux. The poem, written for Puritan poetess Anne Bradstreet, exemplified a little-known facet of John's personality, his great sense of history and of American past.
Homage to Mrs. Bradstreet was published in 1956. It was the first book of John's that I published. I happen to think it's one of his greatest books. It was greeted that way by the critics. I mean, Edmund Wilson, who was certainly one of the best American critics, said it was the best long poem by an American since T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Well, the publication of that book marked an absolute milestone in John's life. He had made it with the publication of that book.
It was a year of change in other respects. Divorced by Eileen, Berryman married again, Anne Levine. The marriage lasted 4 years and produced a son, Paul. Amid continued prizes, publications, and a 2-month stint in India as a lecturer for the U.S. State Department, Berryman continued to teach at the University of Minnesota. He shared an office with friend Saul Bellow in a small temporary wooden structure.
There was always the greatest sympathy between us, although each was aware of the possibly preposterous peculiarities of the other. And once in a while, one would remind the other of these peculiarities, gently, in a sort of kidding way. It was really awfully nice. No, I didn't at all mind it, neither did he. In fact, welcomed that sort of embroidery, psychological embroidery by wit around the circumference of one's little lunacies. But I did love him and appreciated him and miss him.
Berryman worked hard, sometimes spending up to 9 hours preparing a lecture. His classes were always filled to capacity. And he began writing the Dream Songs, a huge series of interwoven poems which took him over a decade to complete. In 1961, his second marriage ended. Berryman married Kathleen Donahue, 25 years his junior. The marriage lasted until his death and brought 2 daughters, Martha and Sarah. He continued working on his all-consuming project. The Dream Songs form a poetic diary of the inner life of a character named Henry, a white, middle-aged American, sometimes in blackface, who has suffered an irreversible loss. Henry has a second voice, a straight man who calls him Mr. Bones and speaks to him in minstrel dialect. The songs delve into the innermost recesses of the soul and of existence, hovering many times on the fragile line between sanity and madness, sometimes crossing over. Subjects range from politics and theology to marriage and children to suicide and the death of friends. In one poem, Berryman states, "These songs are not meant to be understood, you understand. They are only meant to terrify and comfort."
And John wrote these dream songs everywhere he happened to be. He was in New York once. I mean, he'd write them on the back of envelopes. He'd write them in the subways, in taxi cabs. You'd be talking to him at lunch, and he'd take out a little book and start writing some lines down. He was thinking dream songs, writing dream songs all the time.
Friends anywhere in the country might expect a call from Berryman once he had completed a song he particularly liked. Because he suffered from insomnia, this often meant calls at 3 or 4 in the morning, as he relived the rages, desires, and fears of the dream songs. Alcohol increasingly became a kind of stabilizing influence. Few took the drinking seriously. Robert Giroux recalled a time when John stayed at New York's Chelsea Hotel following a college poetry reading. He had been drinking heavily. The 2 went out for dinner, but John wouldn't eat. Giroux brought him back to the hotel and put him to bed.
The next day, the hotel called me and said he'd been taken to the hospital. He had been found out, passed out on the floor of his room in the Chelsea. And I thought this was the end. I went up to see him at French Hospital here in New York that afternoon, and to my astonishment, when I came into the room, he was sitting up in bed writing a dream song. And he was smoking, and he was he looked marvelous. He had been fed, of course, that got some food into his body, and he had a tremendous capacity to recuperate. Regenerative powers were astonishing. So I never took the drinking thing really seriously.
In 1964, the first volume of the Dream Songs, 77 Dream Songs, was published. A year later, it won him the Pulitzer Prize. Asked the most important elements of good poetry, Berryman replied, "Imagination, love, intellect, and pain. Yes, you've got to know pain."
Although I think it's true to say that the psychic wound which led to the suffering John endured during his lifetime cannot really be described to people who have not felt it. On the other hand, I feel that his life was in many ways a very full one. Although there were very low lows, there were also very high highs.
1966 brought another award, a Guggenheim grant, which Berryman used for a year's sabbatical in Ireland. There were more dream songs to write. Kate and young daughter Martha accompanied him. Fame was catching up to John Berryman. Life magazine brought his face into millions of American homes. The BBC sent critic A. Alvarez to talk with Berryman at the poet's favorite haunt, Ryan's Pub. They talked of the dream songs and Henry.
Namely, his friend relieves the tension, relieves the hopeless solitude of Henry, faced with the world as it is, and enables Henry first to calm down a little. Henry is always in a very bad state when Mr. Bones comes in. The friend is, of course, the end man in minstrelsy. Namely, he and Henry are very closely connected. They're part of the same outfit. Huh? But on stage, as they are on stage, the scene has to be given to Henry. And his friend only gets in terms of quite serious disapproval.
The theme of the later dream songs is death and dying. Henry is dead through all of Book 4, and each song is titled Opus Posthumous. In later songs, the poet mourns the death of other writers, Randall Jarrell, Sylvia Plath, Hemingway, and he writes a series of 10 songs on the death of one of his oldest friends, poet Delmore Schwartz. One critic says of Berryman, in the process of writing an elegy on his own brilliant generation, he was also writing an elegy on himself, as if there were no one else he could trust with the task.
Look, let me put this another way, John. If one of the purposes, not one of the purposes, but one of the things you are doing in the dream songs is exploring, as it were, the edge of what is tolerable and what is not tolerable. And in this, I think you're...
Mostly intolerable.
Yeah, mostly intolerable. And what you're, in that, I think you're doing what tends to be done by, as I say, all the poets, whom I think is being really serious. The final thing that is intolerable is death, isn't it? And this is what, for example, possessed Sylvia Plath. And in a sense, she went farthest on that particular dead-end road. Now, Daddy,
you bastard! I'm through. Isn't that a marvelous poem?
That's a great poem.
Don't you think? I call it a great poem also. An unexpected masterpiece from a dying woman.
But she was...
And you know, her father died very early. It's all fantasy. She's only dealing with a father figure, or phantom, and it killed her.
1968. The second volume of the Dream Songs was published. His Toy, His Dream, His Rest. Berryman received the National Book Award and Yale University's Bollingen Prize for Poetry. The year before, the National Endowment for the Arts had presented him with a $10,000 award for distinguished service to American letters. The writing continued, and the teaching. In 1969, Berryman was named a Regents Professor at the University of Minnesota, the highest honor given to faculty members. Relaxation was difficult. Sometimes it meant tennis or a swim. Other times it was listening to blues and jazz, or Mozart, Schubert, and Beethoven. Beethoven was special because of his deafness. Hard of hearing himself, Berryman always turned the music up loud. But mostly, relaxing meant sitting in his rocking chair with a glass of bourbon in one hand and a cigarette in the other, rocking and thinking. Religion often occupied his thoughts. He wavered between his Catholic upbringing and his interest in Judaism and Eastern religions. Toward the end, his belief was in a God of rescue, a concept he'd acquired from reading Augustine and Pascal. The drinking problem became too serious to ignore. Berryman spent time in and out of treatment centers and hospitals, sometimes paying someone to teach his classes for him.
But he was in several treatment centers for alcoholism, and this, although it's very hard to reach the point where that becomes necessary, there were many beautiful things about it, and I guess the main one is that he met many people that he felt very close to, who had the same problem, and they were, I think they were happy times, as well as difficult times for him.
His experience with Alcoholics Anonymous and the weeks and months he spent in a Minneapolis hospital led Berryman to begin work on his first novel, Recovery. The novel's protagonist is Alan Severance, a Pulitzer Prize-winning professor of immunology and molecular biology, a teacher who could give a lecture drunk or sober, who went to great lengths to keep his class schedule at the university. Hospital corridors, bedrooms, and lecture rooms provide the setting. The therapeutic catalyst is the encounter group and resulting confrontations, where a patient's delusions and rationalizations are attacked. Of the AA program's 12 steps, Severance, like Berryman, has not yet mastered step 1, admitting that he is powerless over alcohol, that his life has become unmanageable.
It's an agonizing thing. The feelings caught up in taking that first step are mostly helplessness, hopelessness, agony, really terrible things. And to agonize through that is, well, like Fritz Perls says, hey, to suffer one's death and to be reborn again is music. You know, that's the way it is. It's very difficult. And John was a guy who was a very proud man, and very powerful, and very bright and articulate, and it was easy to work his way around that and give assent to that very easily and quickly. And he tricked himself with his brain power more than anything. That'd be my picture.
As he struggled with his alcoholism, Berryman continued to write. He had become, in the words of his physician, an emotional volcano, a poetry-making machine. Another book of poetry, Love and Fame, was published in 1970. It received mixed reaction. Critic Edmund Wilson sent John a letter saying he found the book hopeless. Deeply hurt by the critical response, Berryman eliminated some poems in the book's second edition. Others, however, liked the new tone of his writing.
Yeah, I think that John, right at the end of his life, was writing some of his best poems, quite different from the rather high-pitched dream songs. These songs, these last poems, are very understated, dead-level quiet, and they're sometimes hard to hear because of that. But I think that the sequence of addresses to the Lord at the end of Love and Fame is a transition to this very quiet, absolutely stripped poetry that he was writing at the end. And I think they'll be recognized as some of his best poems.
In and out of hospitals, exhausted mentally and physically, Berryman struggled to meet his teaching schedules, and still he continued to write. In an interview for the Paris Review, Berryman discussed the concept of ordeal. He said, "The artist is extremely lucky who is presented with the worst possible ordeal, which will not actually kill him." Of his own condition, Berryman said, "I have a tiny little secret hope that after a decent period of silence and prose, I will find myself in some almost impossible life situation and will respond to this with outcries of rage and love, such as the world has never heard before."
In his last year, we hospitalized him at one point when he was not drinking, but he was terribly nervous. For 2 or 3 days, he would speak only in an enraged shout at the top of his voice. He was so tense, so nervous, that he absolutely couldn't contain his rage. Well, he was perfectly aware of this and tremendously upset about it, but simply couldn't prevent this.
I think it was partly that he felt that he was dying. I would guess that he had this unremitting sense of approaching death, that he felt it through the ruin of his body, that when you heard John cough, when you saw John pass out, when you saw his color, you knew that he was a dying man. Furthermore, you knew that John knew it.
Age and the deaths and the ghosts, her having gone away in spirit from me. Hosts of regrets come and find me empty. I don't feel this will change. I don't want anything or person familiar or strange. I don't think I will sing anymore just now, or ever. I must start to sit with a blind brow above an empty heart. Berryman was isolated within the walls of his mind. He thought often of the friends he had lost. Randall Jarrell, who killed himself. Delmore Schwartz, found dead in a seedy Manhattan hotel. Dylan Thomas, who drank himself to death and died in a coma in a New York City hospital with John sitting just outside his room. And still, the original wound festered, his father's suicide. 6 months before the poet's death, Giroux flew to Minneapolis to serve as godfather at the christening of the Berryman's new daughter, Sarah. John had 8 books projected, some of them prose.
He wanted to write a book about sacrifice. He kept talking about sacrifice, and that seems such a strange subject. Sacrifice is very necessary to existence, he said. And he showed me his notes. We sat in his study. And I just didn't understand at that time that he was nearing a point of absolute exhaustion.
During his last year, Berryman worked on 2 projects in addition to his teaching. A new book of poetry, Delusions, etc., was completed and in proof before his death. He flew to California to work on Recovery. Obsessed with the impulse to buy a shotgun, he returned to his home in Minneapolis. There were few inner resources left. 2 nights before his death, he left the house carrying a long-bladed Spanish knife. Instead of using it, he bought a bottle and wrote a last despairing poem in which he pictured himself climbing over the railing of a bridge. His words expressed his terror of giving bad lectures, anguish because students were dropping his course, and fear that he would lose his job. The next night, he wrote a hasty note on the back of an envelope, then threw it away. It wasn't discovered until after his death the following morning. The note read, "Oh, my love, Kate, you did all you could. I'm unemployable and a nuisance. Forget me, remarry, be happy."
He killed himself because his despair was too great to be contained. The chief illusion, I suppose, that nourished him was that he could at any time start over. But I don't think that he believed in it, and perhaps in the end he saw it as a kind of a grim joke, that one could begin once more, anew, with a new house, a new place, a new child, a new resolve, a new breakfast. And after all, the indignity of it must have gotten him.
He said once, writing is just a man alone in a room with the English language, trying to make it come out right. The important thing is that your work be something no one else could do. In that, he most surely succeeded. John Berryman lived many lifetimes in his 57 years. He experienced all things passionately. There was no middle ground. In one of his last poems, he wrote, "I have done this and that which I should do, and given and attended and been still. But why I do so, I cannot be sure. I am suspicious of myself. Help me. I am old and ignorant, and the work is great. Daylight is long. Will ever I be done? For the work is not for man, but the Lord God. Now I have prepared with all my might for it.